Hey everybody, this is Joe Payne here again with another installment of Political Payne in what I think is going to be my first deep dive episode into the topic of police violence, protest, and authoritarianism in the United States, and obviously with what's been going on in the U.S. since the death of George Floyd at the hands of Derek Chauvin, a Minneapolis Police Department officer who, kept his knee on Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. One of the unifying ways of honoring Floyd at protests has been the taking the knee for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. So this has reignited the conversation in the U.S. about police brutality, law enforcement, how they target people of color, specifically Black Americans, and now massive calls for reform of policing in the U.S. So I don't want to spend tons of time here having to just argue that police violence disproportionately affects people of color and Black Americans. That's just a fact. If you don't know that, you have to do your research. I personally recommend this Netflix documentary, 13th, which is about the long history of systemic racism in policing and law enforcement in America, from activists and scholars. And, it goes back to the days of slavery. So you need to know about that. There's a lot of conservative media that tries to make you believe otherwise, but when you just break down the numbers, Black Americans make up 13% of the population, yet they are disproportionately incarcerated, disproportionately arrested, the target of pullovers and stops by police, and the targets of police violence. If you're Black in America, you're orders of magnitude more likely to be killed by an officer than if you're white. And a lot of people try to blame this on, crime statistics, but conservative characters will try to tell you that, well, Blacks just commit most of the crime, so they must, it's warranted. But so much of what the Black Lives Matter movement and calls to, reform policing, defund the police, such like, are bringing to the forefront the issues of generational poverty and income inequality, the realities of urban policing, the austerity for education, mental health care, all other types of programs that help alleviate people out of poverty and help alleviate crime, and how municipal city budgets are overwhelmingly stay strong for law enforcement and for policing. So I'm definitely going to mention a bunch of this stuff again throughout this video, but what I really want to focus on is this conversation and also the actions of police departments and law enforcement, how they've reacted, how their culture informs some of this reaction, and how different communities are responding to this widespread protest and in some cases unrest, rioting, looting that happens mostly in very populated areas, big metropolis cities with large police departments where there's really no ability to affect community policing. And often is the case with the looting and destruction of property, it's more often opportunistic people who know that police departments are preoccupied with protesters. It happened to a very slight degree in the city I'm in, Santa Maria, just blocks away from my house. I did live coverage of that, but even the most casual observers could see that the people who were engaged in that unrest and that destruction were hardly the protesters from earlier in the day who marched peacefully through the streets. And even later, days later, we had another event here in Santa Maria that was organized by the NAACP, the local branch, that was entirely peaceful. There was no reports of any destruction or any crime. And this kind of follows what we've seen in America. The rioting and the unrest has subsided, but peaceful protests have continued. But we've noticed a lot of different things going on. Of course, this is widespread in America. It's affecting big cities, small towns, the capital, where things have been incredibly incendiary. But I want to talk mostly about the conversation about law enforcement, how law enforcement, which, if we're just honest, is an institution by and large that leans conservative, is outright conservative in many ways, and how they are trying to control the narrative and the discussion that's going on, because obviously they definitely understand that their budgets are now under scrutiny from this activist cry to rethink policing, change how things are done, remove the austerity on things like mental health care, education funding, and impose austerity on the police and return law enforcement to a more holistic way of having law and order in the United States. But what we've also seen is massive movement of violence against peaceful protesters by law enforcement. Law enforcement, it appears, has no end of, tear gas canisters, pepper bullets. They just have an endless supply of toys and equipment to, attack American citizens, exercising, a right that is granted in the First Amendment of our Constitution. It's the very first one. As a journalist, I find the First Amendment very important. It establishes a free press, but also the right to free speech and assembly. The people have the right to peaceably assemble. And when, because of the actions of looters and some destruction of property, you've seen curfews imposed all across the U.S., and then anyone out of doors after a curfew has been imposed are just being met with total impunity and violence from law enforcement. Some states have even called the National Guard, and there was one video that showed National Guardsmen firing at people on their own front porch, on their own property, because they weren't indoors. So this is a very concerning overreach of authoritarianism from law enforcement. We just see endless videos of law enforcement engaged in very violent behavior, beating people with batons, firing tear gas directly at people, tear gas canisters, firing pepper bullets at people's faces, which they're told in training to fire them at the ground. And a lot of this really is feeding the movement. It's causing more people to come out because they're angry. They see their community members being attacked by law enforcement because law enforcement knows that they won't be held accountable for this. I'm going to talk a little later about the Trump administration and certain signals and just outright policy decisions they've made to let law enforcement know that they're not going to be held accountable for violence against citizens. But we've seen this, again and again. In some cases, police driving cars into crowds, viciously shoving people to the ground. A young woman in New York got a concussion. We recently saw this elderly man in Buffalo, New York, a longtime Catholic activist who was shoved to the ground by riot police. He's 75 years old, and his skull got cracked on the cement and immediately started bleeding from the ears. I mean, this kind of shows the kind of racial dynamic here, where we have this massive amount of outrage now about this one man who's an elderly white man, and there's renewed anger, people calling out that this is wrong, when this is what Black Americans have been talking about for years and years. And it's finally taking enough white people to go out into the streets, literally putting their bodies on the line, and we're seeing the violence that more people are waking up to the fact that law enforcement has way too much power in the United States. A local law enforcement officer is not accountable to their community. There's lots of policy decisions for this. There's also just the incredible deference that's given to law enforcement by prosecutors. Prosecutors are very unlikely to prosecute law enforcement who overreach their power. Police departments and their officers also have a famous, close relationship where they don't give anybody up. We're continually being told that these actions, like the killing of George Floyd, these are the actions of a few bad apples. But law enforcement has a history of holding the line where they don't give up officers. Police unions are very good at protecting officers who have marks on their record of misconduct, overuse of force. They're protected. Those files are often sealed from public scrutiny. And if you have a federal administration like the Trump administration that signals to police departments you won't be investigated, especially for overuse of force or police brutality.
And when you see these towns and when you see these thugs being thrown into the back of a paddy wagon, you just see them thrown in, rough. I said, please don't be too nice. Like when you guys put somebody in the car and you're protecting their head, the way you put their hand over. Like, don't hit their head, and they've just killed somebody, don't hit their head. I said, you can take the hand away, okay?
Well, then you have police departments that understand quite well that they can just hold the ranks and get away with having violent police officers and corruption. In the case of the man who was pushed over in Buffalo, the Buffalo police specifically released information saying that the man tripped and fell. It was only because there was video evidence that we now know they were lying. There's other cases throughout this whole situation where police departments have been found lying. One police department said that a Rolex store that's windows were smashed, that millions of dollars worth of merchandise was stolen from this business, from this Rolex store. And Rolex announced that they had no merchandise in the store. So we're seeing police departments act very cynically, and it's in an attempt to protect themselves from scrutiny, because what these mass protests are about is about scrutinizing police departments, making them accountable to you and me, to communities, and especially holding individual officers accountable when they commit acts of violence against people. Because oftentimes when we see cases like with Derek Chauvin and other officers who kill unarmed Americans, especially Americans of color, they have a long history. They have a rap sheet of violence against citizens who are unarmed, who weren't doing anything wrong, or just brutality, just over excessive use of force. One example of this is how after the two officers who shoved the man in Buffalo were charged with assault, a whole crowd of his fellow officers were outside the courtroom clapping for the two officers after they were charged with assaulting this man. Many of them on the unit that was involved resigned in protest after these two were being held accountable. So I want to talk right now about the culture of law enforcement, this kind of conservative lean, and how this is even more troublesome during this crisis because the conservative movement has dipped farther to the right since President Donald Trump and his election, but also this kind of penchant for conspiracy theory and paranoia. The Trump administration and Attorney General Bill Barr, immediately after rioting in Minneapolis, Minnesota, wanted to blame Antifa, which is short for anti-fascist. Antifa is best described as a loose term for groups of left-wing radicals across the United States who organize to meet the alt-right and far-right extremists who engage in street protests with violent resistance, basically. Not going to sugarcoat it. Antifa believes that groups like the Proud Boys, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, like we saw in Charlottesville, that they should be met with violent resistance. They don't believe that there's a civil conversation to be had with fascists and neo-Nazis. So that's what Antifa is all about. They have openly attacked people, but for the Trump administration to try to label them as a terrorist group, well, it doesn't fit any real legal definition of a terrorist group. There's no leadership. There's no organizing, unifying principles. Antifa has different little chapters, and it's just anybody can join or identify, and they're not organizing mass violence like we actually are seeing the far right doing right now, trying to take advantage of these protests. Attorney General Bill Barr claimed it was left-wing radicals and anarchists like Antifa just after Minneapolis. But since then, there have been no arrests made. The FBI didn't link Antifa to any unrest in Washington, and none of the FBI arrests made in connection with protests have really linked anybody to the Antifa movement. But we do have examples of far right-wing agitators who were planning attacks, destruction of property, bombs, and shootings of these protests. Specifically in Las Vegas, there were 3 men arrested for that. So the culture of law enforcement shifts conservative. It just always has. Law enforcement as a conservative institution by any definition. If we go back far enough in history, the earliest law enforcement agencies were designed to capture and prevent freed slaves from getting out of the South. But throughout the history of law enforcement, there has always been a right-wing slant. Obviously, the FBI and longtime director J. Edgar Hoover were, very clearly right-wing. They targeted left-wing groups in the United States. They planted spies in left-wing movements, and specifically in movements of Black Americans. The civil rights movement was deeply spied on by the FBI. Police departments did the same thing. They still do it today to a certain degree. There's a really good story on ProPublica about a Black journalist who was spied on by the local police department she was writing about. But during the civil rights movement, police departments bugged the pulpits at Black churches so they could hear what was being said during sermons, especially when Martin Luther King came to town to speak. We also know that law enforcement has been infiltrated by right-wing extremists, and specifically white identity extremists. The FBI put out a report about this, that the Ku Klux Klan and other white nationalist organizations were making a concerted effort to infiltrate law enforcement, whether it was a local PD, a sheriff's office, or bigger agencies like state police, the FBI itself, and the military. Ever since that report came out, little to nothing has been done to address that fact that hardcore right-wing white nationalist neo-Nazis, KKK, have been infiltrating police forces. And there's examples of this in, just spot reporting throughout the decades going back to the 90s. Police stations where Nazi iconography is tagged in the locker room. Officers only get fired when they're without a doubt proven to be a part of these organizations. There were like 3 officers in Texas who were fired for being part of the KKK. There was also a neo-Nazi gang in the LA County Sheriff's Department that got found out years ago. And one individual officer in Chicago was found to have tortured more than 100 black men, tortured them. And nothing was done. He was protected by the officers around him who shared racist attitudes. And, this included shocking people's genitals with electricity. So I'm not saying all police officers are like this, obviously, but police officers have a conservative slant. And so, when you have someone to the extreme far right within the culture of law enforcement, which protects law enforcement, you don't turn on the badge, you hold the line, the thin blue line, all of that stuff. Nothing gets done. Not enough gets done when officers are obviously racist, especially when reports of brutality, even complaints from other officers get suppressed over time. Now, you have to take all of this into account with the rise of far-right extremism. The resurgence of far-right extremism in America hasn't gone anywhere. The biggest domestic terror attack in the U.S. was the Oklahoma City bombing. That was a white nationalist, Timothy McVeigh, who was involved in that. The Columbine shooters, despite inaccurate media reporting that they were angry that they were bullied, they were actually motivated by white nationalist ideology and did it on the anniversary of the attack on Oklahoma City, which was done in many ways in retaliation for the attack by law enforcement on white nationalists at Waco and Ruby Ridge, other situations like that in the 90s that were very high profile that helped ignite this anger on the far right white identity movement. But even then, since Columbine, a lot of school shooters, a lot of mass shooters have connections to white nationalism. The shooting in El Paso, Texas, in Walmart, specifically targeting Mexican Americans. This is part of a bigger movement of extremism, and those are obviously lone wolves. But you also have these organized groups like the Proud Boys, like neo-Nazis, KKK, who often do public demonstrations to incite anger and fear in communities. And because of their First Amendment rights, it's very interesting to see, so many people met with tear gas and batons who are protesting police brutality, kind of an ironic cycle there that the police would meet them with such violence if that's what they're protesting. When we've seen for years far-right extremists showing up with guns, weapons, KKK in their hoods, being protected by police from counter-protesters, people who don't want them in their communities. We've specifically seen in Oregon, where if you don't know your Oregon history, it was founded as a white supremacist state. They didn't want black people in the state when it was first formed, not even as slaves. They didn't want any there. So people have an idea of Portland as being very, very liberal, but go outside Portland, it's not that way. There have been lots of demonstrations by Proud Boys, which, if you remember the founder of Proud Boy, kind of a defunct founder of Vice, he had to disassociate with the movement entirely because he was facing legal action for inciting violence, because part of the membership of the Proud Boys was to get in violent altercations. So you're seeing this right-wing projection about Antifa, calling them terrorists, when you literally have the resurgence of domestic white national terror organizations that are designed in their bylaws, it's made to incite terror and violence. We just recently saw in Oregon a police officer organizing with the Proud Boys during these protests to tell them to get off the street because we don't want to appear to be playing favorites.
Enforce the citywide curfew shutdowns where we can arrest anybody who's walking around. Okay. My command wanted me to come talk to you guys and request that you guys secrete either inside businesses or in your vehicles somewhere where it's not a violation. So we don't look like we're playing favorites.
So, if for people who don't understand that these connections in law enforcement, that these right-wing attitudes are just naturally in law enforcement because of the nature of the institution, but we're continually seeing it colored by extremism and white identity racist extremism. And it's not like this effect on law enforcement only can happen with white police officers. These attitudes towards people of color can even get into the heads of law enforcement of color. We've seen officers of color who aren't white killing or being a part of not attempting to stop brutality against people of color. It kind of illustrates the insidiousness of white supremacy and how it can really just infect the mind of anybody, but especially if you're in one of these institutions. And I mean institutions from the bottom on up. Interestingly enough, the Department of Homeland Security, an analyst with the Department of Homeland Security, put out a report years ago about the resurgence of white nationalist extremists and white supremacist extremism in the United States during the years of President Obama. Honestly, a big part of what we have to understand the Trump era and this extremism on the right that we're seeing is the first black president, Barack Obama. And this DHS analyst put together this report on this rise of white identity politics and extremism, and it was totally quashed by leadership in the Department of Homeland Security because just within that institution, they lean conservative. And when Republican lawmakers got wind of this report, they were livid and furious and did everything they could to suppress it. And obviously, Republicans know that they benefit from these extremist attitudes. President Trump knows he benefits from that. If you don't understand that proposing building a wall at the southern border of the United States is in and of itself a call for white nationalism, then there's no argument to be had. You can downvote me all you want. These are just the facts. I'm a journalist. I'm sharing factually based information here. This is also illustrated in the fact that there was a hearing in Congress about white nationalism and white nationalist extremism, and there was a panel of experts about this issue, explaining how serious it is, the rise of it, citing this report. And the Republicans decided to bring in Candace Owens, who Candace Owens is no expert on anything other than saying what the far right wants to hear any black Americans say. I mean, people have done more thorough takedowns of Candace Owens and her ideas, but basically she was a nobody on the left, had a progressive website, realized she could go conservative and she would be a novelty and make oodles and piles of money. That's, this is the right-wing grift that we see quite a bit. I've alluded to before how much money there is for you if you're willing to just go conservative, which I kind of see like going country in the music biz. You have a built-in audience. There are people waiting with, again, piles of money, think tanks. Turning Points USA is in college campuses trying to influence this information and influence the discourse. And we see law enforcement, because they lean conservative, being influenced by this more far-right, more extremist rhetoric. I specifically, anecdotally, got in a little bit of a back and forth with a local law enforcement employee who tried to argue with me about, police violence and some of this information, and, made very broad claims you hear from the right wing these days. They said that almost all journalists are biased, right? So I'm an independent journalist. What are my biases? I've told you I'm upfront with the fact that I'm more to the left in my politics, but I'm biased towards factual information. I'm biased towards human rights, freedom of speech, everything enshrined in the First Amendment and others. But continually we've seen the right fall deeper and deeper into conspiracy theory and conspiracy mongering. And this officer was no exception. Taking a look at some of their posts and retweets and whatnot, there's InfoWars, there's very extreme, beyond the pale outlets that aren't serving the journalistic mission of truth and fact sharing, but really have totally obvious motives of, polluting the discourse, poisoning the well, and just outright lying. I mean, talk about the conspiracy mongering. It goes to the top. President Donald Trump, tried to conspiracy monger about this elderly man who had his skull cracked in Buffalo, saying that he was some type of Antifa agitator who intentionally slammed his own head harder into the pavement. So it's just insane. Like, as a journalist, as someone who has been attacked for being biased, who has never printed a retraction, who, the worst errors of fact I have gotten are misspelling someone's name, which is one of the most common things we as journalists mess up, and we feel terrible about it every time. I've seen even in local posts in some of these community groups on Facebook, people who claim the whole George Floyd killing itself was some type of a false flag. This is a part to take down Donald Trump. Everything becomes this crazy conspiracy to take down Trump, to the point that Trump is saying, don't believe your lying eyes when you see an old man shoved to the ground and bleeding out of his ears. So you see this wild-eyed conspiracy mongering, and it is having an effect on law enforcement. Continually, law enforcement has shared information about supposed buses full of Antifa coming to communities to, help terrorize and destroy property. In a city to the north of me, in Paso Robles, which I wanted to get to some violence against police there in this video, we saw the police upped their numbers at a protest because they had information that busloads of people from Fresno were going to come. In Arroyo Grande, which is also north of me in San Luis Obispo County, conservative business owners were on top of the roofs of businesses with rifles because they had seen, spurious memes shared online about busloads of Antifa terrorists coming from Fresno, which never showed up. There's other examples of this, again in Oregon, where, conservative people, after seeing conspiracy stuff online, show up in their community with guns and rifles, and they claim this is just to keep everything safe and protect property, but this obviously intimidates protesters who are out there by and large peacefully. Majority pretty much are peaceful, including in this community in Arroyo Grande where people, were aware of these men with rifles on tops of businesses. And you have to pair this with the fact that we now have tons of evidence that the far-right extremists in America are trying to agitate and destroy property and commit violence at these protests. They are trying to take advantage of this situation. There are groups like the Boogaloo Boys who openly, want to sow discord and start a second civil war. Far-right extremists, going back years and years, there have been talks by extremists and conspiracy people of another race war, of this coming race war in America. They just totally ignore the fact that most Black Americans just try to get to their homes every day, go to work. They're not inciting widespread violence against white Americans. They just hope to get home without being the victim of police violence or police brutality. Yet there's this continual insistence by neo-Nazis, KKK people, that there's going to be this race war, and they're actively trying to incite it. Again, 3 men in Las Vegas were arrested by the FBI on domestic terror charges for planning to attack a protest. And we now have multiple accounts of, far-right people committing violence at these events. Whether it's like kind of disturbed people like the guy in Salt Lake City who was shooting a bow and arrow at protesters, who, the local Fox affiliate got on camera, totally uncritically saying, so you said all lives matter and they beat you, didn't they? They didn't care to vet the fact that this guy was shooting a bow and arrow at protesters before protesters understandably reacted and beat the guy. But there's also cases of protesters being killed by people driving cars at them, driving cars into the crowd. It happened in Bakersfield. And whether or not law enforcement considers these to be accidents or, acts of violence. In one case, one guy who drove a car into a protest, his truck actually, was a KKK leader. So we now have multiple accounts like this. This is part of why I waited to make this video, was there to be enough time so we could understand and see some of where this violence was coming from. Of course there are looters. Of course there's opportunistic people. Of course there's violence. Of course some protesters are going to be violent, throw stuff at police. But you have to understand that the police are meeting protesters with incredible violence. This is a breach of the First Amendment, one of the rights enshrined in our Constitution, the right to peacefully protest, and how protesters are being attacked by far-right extremists who their intention is to sow discord and to pollute the movement, essentially. We saw an example of how this infects local law enforcement and their mindset in responding to all this stuff, which something that happened just yesterday here in Paso Robles, that's just like 50 miles north of where I am here in Santa Maria, California, and the SLO County Sheriff. And what happened was the Paso Robles Police Department was ambushed by a shooter. A SLO County Sheriff's deputy was shot in the chin, and there was a bunch of return fire, just a big shootout in this downtown, like at 3 a.m., went on for 45 minutes. The deputy is in critical care, but after the shooter left the area, they later found a transient nearby who had been shot point blank in the head, executed essentially, which they're investigating as a connected homicide. During a press conference to update the public about this, SLO County Sheriff Ian Parkinson, while admitting that they had no information about the shooter other than a picture, didn't have his name, didn't know any information about this individual, linked his actions to the Black Lives Matter movement, which he described as a rise up anti-police movement. Again, Black Lives Matter is to address police brutality and policing reform in America, but he linked this attack without any evidence to the movement and to protests. And within that same day, I did some reporting on this on my website, Political Payne. They learned the identity of the shooter, who obviously is a man with severe mental illness. There's previous reports of him causing scenes. A train had to be stopped with him on it because of his rantings about violence and crazy stuff. His Facebook is just a case study in mental illness. It's very sad. Whether or not the movement against police, triggered in his mind somehow to attack the police, I mean, who knows? Who can really say? It's just interesting that far-right extremism and mass shootings are often explained away as it's a mental illness problem. It's not a gun problem. It's not an extremism problem. It's just mental illness. And as a person in media, as a journalist, I'm continually told by law enforcement when they kill somebody or when something like this happens that you need to wait for all the facts before you jump to conclusions. And here we have a leader in local law enforcement absolutely jumping to conclusions and linking a deranged individual's ambush on police, with this movement that is calling for police reform. And this is part of how law enforcement has shifted the conversation into their own victimization, saying they feel under attack from people criticizing, from the media, and this might help explain why we've seen multiple accounts now of law enforcement brazenly attacking members of the media who are clearly journalists, who have cameras, have badges. They're shouting, "Oh, press, press." A friend and colleague of mine in Oregon was shot point blank from an armored vehicle with tear gas, even though his hands were up and he said, "Press, I'm press, I'm press, please, don't do anything." Another journalist, she has lost all vision in her eye after being hit by a pepper bullet or a non-lethal round, whatever. It's kind of hard to keep up with all the different methods and weapons that law enforcement are employing, not just against the public, but journalists as well. I'm not saying journalists that we should be some protected class and we're any more important than citizens who get attacked by police brutality, but this shows an incredible amount of impunity from law enforcement, that they feel comfortable not just attacking people in front of the cameras, but attacking the camera people, attacking journalists. In fact, the U.S. just recently was put on the list of more dangerous countries for journalists. If you don't understand how the implications of attacking journalists, and again, I mentioned earlier that police departments are actively spying on and surveilling specifically black journalists. If you don't understand that connection to authoritarianism and yes, fascism, then hey, I can't help you. You got to read your history, buddy. You got to do some work. And I think that's a big thing that we are seeing in America right now, is that a lot of people, have a lot of work to do to understand all of the issues. This is a complicated thing. We have internesting problems. Obviously, the shooting in Paso Robles, it might have been avoided if we had any kind of functioning mental health apparatus in the United States. For years and years and years, mental health, affordable housing, education have all been eroded and chipped away at by austerity measures, while policing through the war on drugs, through the crime bill, which again, if you want to point the finger at both sides, President and candidate against Donald Trump, Joe Biden, was a major architect of the crime bill in the 90s. This focus on law and order and law enforcement, while defunding holistic programs that actually help reduce crime and have led to the criminalization of the homeless, of the mentally ill, we're now seeing the dividends of that. We're seeing how all these issues are stacking up and just being exacerbated by the fact that law enforcement, there's all the problems with law enforcement, on top of the fact that they're expected to, deal with mental health crises. They're now in schools trying to police children and their behavior and all these other things that really shouldn't be in the job description of an officer, who's carrying a gun. To really, we expect police officers to help us when we have instances of crime and violence that are totally out of our control, and to investigate mostly crimes after the fact. Yeah, we call police when we're in a crisis and need help, but there's also just all the crimes that detectives focus on and investigate after the fact. So there really isn't the need for this kind of militaristic policing. And also the complicated nature of this issue is illustrated in the fact that every police department is different. Every city is different. Here in Santa Maria, I gave our police department credit for not having a militaristic, cracking skulls approach to the protest that happened on May 31st, which included a bunch of unrest and people kind of causing a scene. Law enforcement know that they're the target of these protests, that they are the ones in question. And so, some departments are very savvy about having a more measured response, so the news cycle doesn't once again become more police brutality. But we've got to be aware of how law enforcement is trying to actively shift this conversation away from themselves. They're definitely afraid of the progress that activists and activism in the United States have made. The Minneapolis Police Department is basically going to disband and reform in a total rethinking of of law enforcement in that city, in that community. And I'm sure other agencies are afraid of that too. This really has opened up a conversation into how much of a municipal budget really goes to a police department. Here in Santa Maria, we have 42+% of the whole budget just going to the police department. More than 50% is just public safety with the fire department. But because of the austerity that's now being imposed because of the coronavirus fallout, the lack of revenue, the first programs that are on the chopping block are services that most people actually want, like, Parks and Recreation. Full disclosure, I do work part-time for the Santa Maria Parks and Recreation Department as a music teacher. But also the library. The library is like 0.8% of the budget, and the library is going to be closed until much later to save money when the police department gets most of the budget. So I think that law enforcement officials and politicians are, in some ways cynically, some ways not so cynically, trying to shift the conversation to kind of protect these interests of funding and law enforcement. Police unions have incredible amount of power. The donations they make to politicians factor into it. We also have to look at the federal policy and what's going on there. The Democratic leadership in the House, led by Nancy Pelosi. Check past video for some of my critique of Pelosi's leadership during this time. But they proposed a reform bill that doesn't really acquiesce to a lot of what activists want. It really is a lot of common sense legislation that has been employed in places and doesn't necessarily it hasn't necessarily been proven to help in a widespread, holistic way. it's a lackluster response, to the if you're an activist, if you're using as a baseline the massive reforms that people in the Black Lives Matter movement are calling for. But on the other side of the aisle here, we have President Donald Trump, his administration, actively sowing disinformation, actively politicizing this whole situation of widespread protests and unrest, blaming left-wing radicals and Antifa when there's really no evidence for that, and making several very disturbingly authoritarian moves, like deploying military police in the Capitol, some called secret police, because they had no insignia, no badges, and they were basically an amalgamation of officers from different parts of the Department of Homeland Security. These officers were deployed by Attorney General Bill Barr, which the Attorney General does not command a police force, but he did in the case. He basically created one out of whole cloth to police Washington, D.C. And we saw the outcome of that when peaceful protesters in Lafayette Square across from the White House were gassed and attacked, which a journalist who was on the scene at the time, who they were also attacked as well, said this was a 100% peaceful protest. And these protests were shot at, disbanded, so that Donald Trump could take a photo op at this Episcopal church across the street. These officers actually attacked Episcopal priests who were sitting there at their church, shot at them with tear gas, and ordered them to disperse so Trump could come up and hold the Bible in front of the church. And if you know anything about the Episcopal Church, has a very strong activist and, you could say liberal or left, but really it's a human rights and humanist approach, using their religious organization to call for unity and civil rights and human rights. But Trump was giving a speech and at the time that this happened, and this was the speech where he famously called for the deployment of the military throughout the United States, which I think the majority of Americans, at least in the polling, show that were absolutely find repugnant. It's insane to want to deploy the military. We already have enough states deploying their own National Guard, and we're seeing how that's not going smoothly or well in all cases. But now to deploy the military domestically, I mean, that's authoritarianism, fascism 101, people. I think tons of people were turned off by that tack. But disturbingly, while Trump was calling for law and order in the United States, during the speech, you could hear the explosions from just the other side of the White House. He was doing this in the Rose Garden these military secret police were clearing the way for his photo op.
All Americans were rightly sickened and revolted by the brutal death of George Floyd. My administration is fully committed that for George and his family, justice will be served.
I mean, you have to understand that, that this all didn't just happen now. The Trump administration, made clear signals and policy decisions, rolling back Obama-era policies that, put in consent decrees to investigate police departments with situations of racism and police brutality. But they also rolled back an order that Obama passed to prohibit the selling of military hardware to domestic police departments, which is something that's been widespread ever since the war on terror and George W. Bush. Police departments were allowed to buy decommissioned equipment from the military. There's an armored vehicle owned by the Santa Maria Police Department that was procured by a police nonprofit here in town that just some anonymous benefactor just had hundreds of thousands of dollars to drop and pitch in on a Bearcat, being here to patrol the streets of Santa Maria. So the Trump administration has made it easier for police to get away with brutality. They've made it easier for police to procure militarized hardware. And now we see how Trump and his administration are behaving in the face of this massive civil rights movement, probably one of the largest civil rights movements in history by the numbers, calling for a reform on policing and specifically focus on police violence and how it affects communities of color. It's just really crazy to see all of this, and it makes me think of a conversation I had just after the primaries in 2016 and before the election, when Bernie lost. Full disclosure, I'm a Bernie guy. the primary, and it was Hillary versus Trump. For me, it was like a splash of cold water, and I realized, oh my goodness, Trump could win. And I paid close attention to the rise of Trump and the rhetoric he used. And to me, it was very concerning. He attacked just about every clause in the First Amendment, attacked the press, called them fake news, but also talked about loosening up libel laws so rich people like him would have an easier time suing newspapers out of existence. But he attacked religious freedom through the Muslim ban. He also attacked the right of assembly. He opined when protesters would show up at his rallies that, well, in the good old days, we take them out on a stretcher, punch them in the face, I'll pay your legal bills, stuff like that. So I saw Trump as dangerous, as dangerous to civil liberty here in America. And I was having a conversation with a guy I'm friendly with. He's actually a business owner here in town and a Republican. And he said he was voting for President Trump. And he said, buddy, I'm a single issue voter. Second Amendment. There's been this insistence on the right that any type of gun control just equals they're going to take the guns, right? So I remember talking with him and saying, I know you like the Second Amendment, but have you read the first one? And do you understand why it might be actually under attack from your candidate that in a very much more real way than what you believe to be the attacks on the Second Amendment from the other side? And it really didn't concern him. And I remember him saying at the end of our conversation, he said, and you know what, buddy, if Trump gets elected, 4 years, what's the worst that could happen? How bad could it get? And here we are. His business has been closed for months now because of the spread of a virus, which I believe could have been preventable with good governance. Check out a previous video I did about that. But now we're mired in mass protests, civil unrest, and violence. Numerous people have died, law enforcement included, but more citizens in the wake of this massive wave of protest, unrest, and continued brutality from law enforcement. So I just think we need to be honest. I think law enforcement needs to be honest. There's actually a really good commentary on Medium from a guy who was an officer, and he speaks quite frankly about not just the culture of law enforcement, but training and how the training of law enforcement has been upped, militarized, and increasingly hinged on paranoid, fear-based tactics. So this concludes my first deep dive episode of Political Payne. There's a lot here. I have tons of links in the description if you're interested in any of what I talked about. I'm sure there are links I didn't even get to, but I spent hours reading and researching to put this video together so we could have a frank conversation about law enforcement, about civil liberties, about the right to assemble, about the freedom of the press, and this kind of authoritarian attitude that we're seeing from law enforcement, tasked with, again, upholding the Constitution. Some law enforcement get it. In my community, I've spoken with police officers, watch commanders who speak with the press about this stuff. And the SMPD did a really good job at the NAACP protest and the original protest, I believe, because they will voice and do believe, I think, that they're here to protect the Constitution. And you've actually have seen that expressed by the military itself. Military leadership has voiced opposition to Trump's call to deploy the military on the streets of the United States, which should concern just about any freedom-loving American. So I don't want anyone to think it's all bad, that it's all crazy, that there's nothing but bad actors in law enforcement or positions of power. But there are these influences, there are these issues. We have to be honest about them. And I think reform is going to take many forms, and I think it's going to be a good thing. But until my next video, this has been Political Payne. I'm Joe Payne, independent journalist here in Santa Maria, California. Just trying to help you see through the noise, get more of the signal from the noise, and kind of condense all this information. I'm a news junkie, so if you want to help understand this stuff, that's what I'm here to do. Political Payne, politicalpayne.com. I'm sharing some of my original reporting, live coverage of some of these protests in my community. But here on YouTube, I'm trying to do these bigger breakdowns, help you understand issues. Maybe you're not super into politics, but you want to try to understand all this craziness that's going on during this era. So please like, subscribe, hit the bell, follow. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, I'm here on YouTube. Really appreciate your eyes, really appreciate you watching and taking the time. So I'll see you next time, everybody.